So I'd like to start today's webinar about tools for getting a Shared Service Alliance off the ground by introducing our two presenters, Libby Popick and Sharon Easterling. Libby has been a partner in Opportunities Exchange since 2009. She brings over 25 years of business, nonprofit, and private foundation work to Shared Services, and she has a strong understanding of the many business and organizational issues that are faced by the child care sector. We're also going to hear from Sharon Easterling. She joined Opportunities Exchange in 2016 after serving 24 years as the Executive Director of the DVACE, the Delaware Valley Association for the Education of Young Children. In that role, Sharon led the organization's work as the leading provider of professional development services to ECE programs in southeastern Pennsylvania, as well as statewide ECE advocacy efforts. So I'm now going to turn this over to Libby to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So I want to start by welcoming you all. And let me just tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to define some terms for you, walk you through the process of getting started, and show you some tools on the Opportunities Exchange website to help you with that. And then we're going to hear 3 real-life stories of alliances that have gotten started. And then we're going to talk about some lessons learned. And we're going to definitely leave time at the end for questions. So Karen mentioned this briefly, but just for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are, as Karen said, a nonprofit consulting group. Our mission is to improve outcomes for children. So that's the only reason we're doing this. We both provide technical assistance to providers who want to transform the way they do business, and we work to shape public policy and public financing to incentivize this. So I want to start with a definition of terms because I know that a lot of people have different ways of thinking about shared services, and what we mean when we're talking about it is a framework. It's a framework that allows a network of centers or homes or both to share staff and share costs, usually through some kind of central office or hub. And the way that we view it is as a way to strengthen an organization's capacity, both on the business side and on the pedagogical or teaching and learning side. And that's done by pooling needs and sharing resources. So when we talk about a shared service alliance, what we're talking about, and sometimes people refer to them as networks, but we generally refer to them as alliances. We're talking about a group of programs, which we sometimes call members, that get together and create an intentional and collaborative structure to share staff and information and resources. And this could be a group of independent providers who are sharing some of what they do. It could be a multi-site group of centers. It could be a network of homes. Each alliance is unique in how they're structured and what they share, but they all share the same essential goal of trying to build their capacity to provide high-quality care. We talk about hubs and members. When we talk about a hub, what we mean is some entity that is providing some services to the alliance members or partners. So it could be a large center. It could be another type of organization like a resource and referral agency. Generally, there's some kind of membership or contract fee or grant support that supports this kind of structure. And a member or a partner is, in our lexicon, a center or a home that agrees to join with others to procure services together, usually through a hub. It's important for us to clarify here that, as I mentioned previously, that we believe this is all about high-quality early care and education. And what shared services helps programs to do is to build strong leadership both on the pedagogical side in child development expertise and coaching and teacher supervision and things like that, and also on the business side in terms of maintaining full enrollment and fundraising and reporting and compliance and things like that. So it's our belief that you cannot have high-quality care without having strength in both of those areas, and shared services helps to do that. I also want to make the point that there are roles in this delivery of high-quality care beyond the providers. Providers in shared services collaborate with other providers, sharing data, sharing resources, rethinking how they get things done. But there's a role for policymakers as well in terms of both creating incentives and getting rid of disincentives for providers to join alliances, enabling pilots to test new strategies. And there's a role for philanthropy and business in providing funding and assistance to get these alliances started, either through one-time startup costs or through gap funding to address the cost of high-quality care. But everybody in this, providers, policymakers, and philanthropy and business, all need to be willing to think about the business of early care and education in a different way than we have in the past. So here's an overview of what we call the getting started process. You got to understand the needs of the local providers, and then find one or more hubs that can serve those needs. Then you have to find interested and likely members, identify what the hub or hubs is going to provide to the members, develop some kind of contract or memorandum of understanding, develop a business plan, and go find some money to do it. And I'm going to go into more detail on each of these steps. So what we wanted to do today in particular is to be sure that you could see where particular tools are on the Opportunities Exchange website that address all of these issues that I'm going to talk with you about. So rather than doing a live web demo and risking technological challenges, what I've provided here is some screenshots, and you'll all be able to get a copy of this PowerPoint afterwards, so you'll be able to see these screenshots. But if you go to the Opportunities Exchange website, there's a navigation bar across the top, and there's a section called Shared Services Central, which I've highlighted up in the upper right, and that's where most of the tools and resources are. And within that section, there are 3 sections, which I've circled below, where most of the information, the resources that we're going to be talking about today are located. So there's a section called Shared Services 101, Alliance Design and Business Planning, and Management Agreements. And in each of those areas, there's drop-downs with subcategories and documents. So the more detailed version of what we're talking about today is in something that's called the Shared Services Startup Kit, and that's in the Alliance Design and Business Planning section of the website, and we encourage you to take a look at that. So step 1, understanding providers' needs. You need to understand what the key challenges are that are common among whichever providers you're thinking about, and which of those challenges are something that could be shared among sites. Sometimes it's really helpful to probe rather than just ask an open-ended question about what are your challenges, because you want to really find out a range of issues that they may be facing. There is a sample protocol for interviewing centers and with a list of challenges to kind of probe about on the website, and that can easily be adapted for family child care as well. The next step is to identify one or more hubs. And what we encourage folks to do is to focus on organizations that have the key skills and trust that's necessary. So you would look for an organization, for instance, that had some fiscal management experience, hopefully in the early care and education field, someone who's able to administer a child management system, someone who has fund development skills, someone who has some unique pedagogical leadership skills. So you want to find somebody who's able to who has value and is able to address provider needs. It's possible to have more than one hub in an alliance. So you could have one organization that provides back office financial and administrative services to a group of centers or homes, and another that could help build classroom quality. That's what we call pedagogical leadership. The hubs can be located outside the local community, but the only way to do that, obviously, is if you've got a virtual connection, so you've got to be technologically linked for that to happen. Some potential examples are a large child care center that's very strong administratively, a multi-site group that already has centralized several functions, an intermediary organization that has a particular strength in one or more areas. You can even get more creative and look at organizations like the Alliance in New Hampshire has done by looking at a property management organization, or community or family foundations that are very, very connected to the local community. There's a document on the OPEX website called Characteristics of Successful Shared Services Hubs, and it'll give you some help in terms of what to look for. There is also a very well put together sample RFQ for hub selection that one of the communities that we worked with used, and I think that's a terrific document for you to take a look at. Even if you're not going to do an RFQ, it's got a lot of good information in it that I think would be helpful. So then you're going to want to identify who the Alliance members are that are going to be part of this, and it's good to keep in mind that these alliances are partnerships. So the members have to share interests and they have to share values. So an example of that would be a desire to improve the quality of care, or a particular focus on making sure that there is high job satisfaction. The criteria for membership can be determined by the members themselves. They can be determined by the hub, by the funder, or some combination of those. They can be centers or home-based, or both. They can be nonprofit or for-profit. And it's okay to start small. The examples that you're going to hear about today, the 3 examples, all started with 2 or 3 providers and gradually expanded as they gained experience. Actually, well, 2 of them have expanded. Organizations who are participating in a shared service alliance have to be open to operating differently in the past, and they have to be able to trust one another and trust the hub. If you invest time and care in this step of developing trust, if it doesn't already exist, it will definitely pay off down the road. So once you've figured out who the hub is and who the members are, then it's time to identify what exactly is going to be shared. And essentially this is a matchup between what the hub is able to provide and what the likely members want or need. And as I said before, different hubs can provide separate services, and it's okay to start with 1 or 2 services. Sometimes that's very smart because it gives you a chance to gain some experience and then to be able to point to that experience to expand what you do. Having the right technology is critical to sharing data and information, and we can't stress that enough. And it's really important here to do some in-depth research both among the hubs and the members to really hone this matchup of services. You can do focus groups to identify needs. You can do some in-depth visits to hubs and members. One tool to help you do that is something we call the Shared Services Audit Questionnaire for centers. Again, it can be altered for homes as well. But it's just a series of very in-depth questions that gets at what is going on in a particular center, who's doing what kinds of things are happening, how does this organization operate, what are their needs. The next step would be to establish some kind of contract or memorandum of understanding that really guides the partnership. And it might be that you start in a memorandum of understanding I'm going to refer to as an MOU. It might be that you start with an MOU that just identifies the roles and responsibilities for this planning process. But once the alliance is going to be formed, the contract or the MOU really needs to clarify the roles and activities and responsibilities. And these are, while there are some sample MOUs, and I'll show you where they are on the website, these decisions about how folks are going to work together and who's going to do what are really unique to each alliance and are going to evolve from the steps that I've described. So, you're going to want to talk about who's going to do what task, what data is going to be shared, how, by whom, how are decisions going to be made, what kind of performance metrics are required, how's the data going to be gathered, how's the cost of providing the service going to be covered, what is the role of the board in each, if the organizations have boards, what's the role of the board in each participating organization. So those are just some examples of the kinds of things you want to include in there. And as I mentioned, there's 2 sections where you're going to find some good sample MOUs and governance documents. The one section is management agreements and the other is governance structure. And I would point you in particular to a document called Sample MOU number 1. But I obviously would encourage you to look at all of them. So the next step is to create a business plan, and that's really a blueprint for alliance action. And I would encourage you not to be stymied by the concept of a business plan, because when we think about a business plan, we're not talking about a 30-page document. We're talking about essentially a PowerPoint presentation or some kind of outline of a plan that really says what you're going to do and how you're going to finance that strategy. And if you want to go raise startup funds, you got to have a plan. It's okay to bring in an outside resource to help with that plan, but if you do that, it's really important that folks in the alliance play an active role in it, both to make sure that there is strong understanding and buy-in, and also to keep the costs of bringing in outside consultants down. And the key elements that you want to have in a business plan are the overview and the goals of the alliance, what's happened to date, who the proposed hub or hubs is or are, what the core values are, what the proposed structure is going to be in terms of staffing and operating model and decision-making process, what's going to be shared, and very importantly, what is going to be the measure of success. How are you going to know whether this works or not? What's the timetable, and what are the funding sources and budget? So an example of a terrific business plan is on the website. It's the Philadelphia Early Learning Alliance, and it is a PowerPoint presentation that, like I described. There are other business plans as well, but that one I think is a good example. And the final step is to identify funding. So there's 2 types of costs. There's startup costs, and these are one-time costs such as buying software or licensing fees to bring in these automated information systems. It might be hiring some initial personnel to lead the setup of the alliance. And then there's ongoing costs, which might include personnel. It might include third-party contracts like joint janitorial or food service. Most alliances need startup costs for 1 to 3 years, but the goal is usually to raise funds both for startup and for ongoing costs while at the same time working towards sustainability. A lot of times we get asked, what is a typical fee? And there really isn't a typical fee, but the concept here is that eventually the members should be able to cover the cost of the alliance, and if they can't, then there's a problem because we're trying to be more efficient here. And a lot of times members are very concerned about this concept of having to pay a fee or to share in the expense of this. But it's important to remember that whatever members have to end up paying to the Alliance should be more than offset by both cost savings and revenue increases that are generated by the work of the Alliance. When you're looking at potential funders, it's important to think about local and regional foundations and other organizations that are committed to early childhood and understand the local market and are going to be responsive to the kind of improvements that shared services offers. There are some national funders of early childhood education, a few, but most of them look for evidence of local funding support, and they really are unlikely to make startup grants in targeted communities, so it's really not something that you should assume as a source. In the fundraising and evaluation section of the Tools and Info page is an example that the New Hampshire Alliance wrote several years ago called a Strategic Investment Letter of Inquiry, which I would encourage you to take a look at. So that's the nice, neat steps 1 through 7 outline. And the reality is that it doesn't always happen that way, of course. All of those steps are necessary, but they can happen in a different order. They can happen simultaneously. The one thing I will say is that it's very important, well, I will say more than one thing. The first thing I will say is that it's very important to identify the hub or hubs early on. And this is something that Opportunities Exchange has learned ourselves. We did not initially focus on this when we were getting into this business, but we understand now how important that is. We have also come to see that imposing, and I use that word on purpose, imposing shared services on a community without a community's buy-in just does not work. We've seen that really because being part of a shared service alliance is a very different way of doing business, or of conducting oneself in the early care and education sector, it requires that the member believe that what they're going to expend in terms of time and trouble and bother and money to form an alliance, that all of that stuff is going to be outweighed by all the benefits of the alliance. And so if someone comes in and just says, you should just do this, it's going to be much more difficult to make that happen. And of course, as I've been saying, trust is really key. The convening organization, whether that's a hub, whether it's a foundation, or whoever it is, needs to be trusted by the providers and the hub. And then the members or partners both have to trust the hub, but they also have to trust each other. How long does this take? Well, it can take at least 6 to 12 months. It can often take longer than that to get going. Those communities that are already deeply connected to the provider issues and their needs and to potential hubs can move more quickly, and you'll hear one example of that. Do you need seed funding? It really helps. It's not always essential, but it can speed the startup process. And by enabling the alliance to have free or reduced, so-called membership fees, at least for a while, can really increase the willingness of someone to join an alliance and kind of get, try it for a while. So I am going to stop now, and we're going to hear some examples of some 3 alliances that have actually gotten started in the last couple of years, and then we'll turn to some lessons learned afterwards. But I'm going to, at this point, turn the mic over to Sharon Easterling to talk about the Richmond Area Shared Alliance. Sharon, I don't hear you.
Sharon, are you on mute? Maybe you can send me a text, Sharon, if you're having some problems.
Okay. While Sharon is dealing with that, I'll get started. Okay. And Sharon, just jump in whenever you can. The Richmond area, Shared Alliance was launched earlier this year. It started with 3 centers, and the hub of this organization is an organization called Commonwealth Autism, which is a nonprofit serving special needs kids. Right now there's a project coordinator and a fiscal coordinator and a technician. They are all part-time, and the hub is going to be is going to be providing both back office supports in terms of both tuition and revenue collection, accounts payable, payroll, and all of the things that you see listed there, as well as pedagogical supports, which are the pedagogical piece of this is in development right now. This alliance is really interesting because it was incubated by the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation along with some other local funders who had been working for a long time on the issue of the lack of strength of the early care and education sector in Richmond. So they had some long-standing concerns about failures of ECE businesses, especially in low-income areas of Richmond. And so they got together to try to encourage or incubate this idea. So the key step in this process was to identify a hub, and what they were looking for was a very – you there, Sharon?
Oh, no, not yet. We're still working to get her back on.
Okay, I'll just keep talking. So the key step was to identify a hub, and Commonwealth Autism was not necessarily the expectation of who the hub was going to be, but they are a very high-functioning agency. They do not have right now any direct child care management experience, but they have a mission fit in terms of serving children and wanting and focused on the delivery of very high-quality care.
I think I'm in. Can you hear me?
Oh, good. Okay.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I hope I did it justice. Go ahead.
You were great. Let me just take the wheel for a couple of minutes here. So I think the most important thing to know about the Richmond experience, and I think Libby was just really starting to talk about that, when we sat down to make a list of all of the possible candidates to be a hub, Commonwealth Autism was absolutely not in our minds. They didn't have any real direct experience and regular interaction with the child care community. But they're a very high-functioning organization, and here's what I think was so interesting about why this intersected with their mission. Because their goal is to create inclusive settings for children on the spectrum, they had firsthand experience of not being able to find high-quality early childhood settings for kids, families with which they were working. And so they really understood the need to support early childhood programs, and they understand the need to build supply. And so when you combine their real mission and interest in the sector along with an entrepreneurial spirit, a real commitment, and demonstrated projects around innovation, just real creative thinking and a willingness to try new things, they really emerged as the right entity to become the hub. And the experience has been absolutely terrific. Once they were chosen as the hub, at the same time, we identified 3 local early childhood programs that stepped up to the plate and said, we'd like to go first. We'd like to be part of the pilot group to figure this out together. And so at the same time, we had some of these key things happening. The very first thing that we did was we got each of those child care programs onto a common child care management system with the goal of having the hub be able to access their data. And so that's all beginning to happen. The data is now able to be viewed by the hub. And I'll just tell you that we are focusing on some really interesting business metrics. We're looking at the iron triangle, so we're going to be measuring those 3 pieces around the financial health and the iron triangle with a special emphasis on understanding the cost of care. we think in this community we have probably even larger than typical gap between the cost of care and what folks are being paid. And so we're going to really focus in on that. And the other thing that people identified that they want to measure and really try to improve is compensation for staff. And I know that that's really common in the field, but there are some unique characteristics in Virginia that make this really ripe for work. And so we're going to be really focusing in on kind of realigning all available resources to address the issue around compensation, and we plan to track compensation and benefits over the next couple of years to understand the impact. So it's a very exciting project in Richmond, and if you want to read more details, you can see from the screen that there is a document on the website. I encourage you to go there and read more about what's happening. And I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Karen Morrell, to talk about her experience in Battle Creek.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. So the Battle Creek Alliance is very new. They just launched this year in January, and the launch occurred after a planning phase. In 2016, they went through a 6-month planning phase to really assess the feasibility of launching an alliance and also to develop that 3-year business plan that Libby talked about. So the alliance started with 3 centers. They're all nonprofit, and they're all located in a low-income neighborhood, and they're fairly close in geographic proximity to one another. One of the reasons that these 3 centers came together is that they were all interested in strengthening their business operations and improving quality. The directors for these centers were all directors that were considering retiring, wanting to retire in the near future, but really feeling like their centers were not in shape both in terms of the operations and in terms of the quality that they'd like to see before they left. So they thought that shared services would be the right strategy for them to engage in to really shore up their centers. The other thing that I think is important to note about these 3 centers is that they had a history of working together. They had a relationship. So earlier you heard about trust, the importance of trust between the providers. That was there in Battle Creek. So I think that really helped kind of facilitate the process for them to work together. So the hub is the Battle Creek Community Foundation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about their role on the next slide. But there's actually 3 staff members that support the work of the Alliance. In Battle Creek, we have a part-time CPA, and we're really fortunate because the CPA is also a former owner of a child care center, so we've got someone that knows the business of child care and has accounting expertise. The Alliance also has a part-time business leadership coordinator and a part-time pedagogical leadership coordinator. And the business leader works closely with the centers, helping them with all the tasks associated with strengthening their operations. And then the pedagogical leader works with the centers to improve the teaching and learning. And there's a suite of services that's being offered to the three centers. First, under the bucket of business leadership, the Alliance is providing fiscal management services to the 3 centers. All of that is going to be centralized and done by the hub. So one of the first things that the centers had to do was to get automated. So they're all now using the same child management system, and the hub is able to access their data and provide fiscal management services for them. Second set of services is all around professional development. Each center has a lead person who's responsible for the pedagogical leadership of that center. They are responsible for working with the teachers in the center, and they participate in monthly activities, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. And then the third area of services that's provided to these centers is a subpool and staff recruitment service. This is really very new. It just launched in July. In July they had their first training of subs. Battle Creek has decided to hire kind of subs in cohorts, so they'll do trainings. Well, I think at the July training there were 8 subs that were trained and oriented to all their centers, so they are continuing to ramp that up. So I'll go to the next slide and tell you a little bit more about the Battle Creek Community Foundation. I mentioned that they were the hub. And I think they were selected. There were a couple things that were really helpful for the Battle Creek Community Foundation. One was their commitment to early care and education. They have strong connections to the centers in the field. They have been funders of much of this work, and they had a vested interest really in ensuring that these centers are providing high-quality education. The foundation also had infrastructure to be able to provide some services and supports to the center, so it seemed like a great fit. So the foundation, Battle Creek Community Foundation, is providing, as I mentioned, the staffing, so they're providing in-kind support. But then we also have funding from two other funders, the Kellogg Foundation and the Binda Foundation. In terms of structures, the centers are still independent. They are remaining independent, but they've agreed to collaborate and share around a set of services. So the first thing that they've all agreed to do in terms of business leadership is track certain metrics. And part of that, like I said, mentioned using the same child management system that really facilitates their ability to focus on metrics. They're also focusing very closely on that iron triangle. Sharon mentioned that in Richmond as well. In Battle Creek, they're doing the same thing. They are really laser sharp focused on making sure that each of the centers is fully enrolled, that they're collecting their fees in full, and that they're ensuring that their revenues cover costs. In terms of pedagogical leadership, they have collective goals around quality as well. So they have goals both for the rating for each center and scores for each classroom. Each of the centers has committed to participate in professional development, in coaching. There's a community of practice that has been set up, and also to take that learning back to the center. And if you want any more details about the Battle Creek Alliance, you can see their profile, which can be found on the Opportunities Exchange website. And so now I'm going to turn it to Libby to talk about San Francisco.
Great. And we do see your questions. We're going to try to answer those questions in just a few minutes when I'm done. So the San Francisco Early Learning Alliance was launched in early 2015. It began with 3 centers, but now is up to 6 agencies that are operating 8 sites. The hub is a central office that was initially housed at the home of the Mimi and Peter Haas Fund, which was the organization that was really the incubator. The hub office is now in a more central location in San Francisco. And the staffing at this point, although it was not like this initially, is a full-time Alliance director and 2 full-time specialists, one in data management and one in need and eligibility. They are providing enrollment, data management, and reporting, which in California is a particularly difficult and involved job, fiscal management, and human resources. It's a really interesting alliance, and so a couple of things I want to tell you about them. First of all, the leader, the alliance director, was identified from one of the participating centers. She was a very strong financial manager in one of the original centers, and she agreed to expand her responsibilities to perform the same tasks that she was doing for one center for the other 2 at that point. At that time, there were 2 others. Since then, her responsibilities have expanded both in terms of the types of activities that she is overseeing and also the number of centers in the alliance. The regional funder, the instigator or incubator of the alliance, as I mentioned, was a regional funder, the Mimi and Peter Haas Fund, and the initial participating centers were part of a group of centers that the fund had worked with for many years. So the fund had relationships with those providers and very close relationships with those providers. And the providers had, to some degree, relationships with each other. So there was already some trust built in there. Another thing that I think is really important about this alliance is that they do and have always assessed membership fees to each center for the services. Those fees are based on documented or anticipated based on experience staff hours that are required by the hub staff to do that work. So in other words, the hub staff is very carefully either keeping track of, or if they don't have the experience, estimating how many hours will be required to work with that center to do that kind of work, and then basing their fees off of that. The anecdotal results are really terrific from this organization. They have been able to grow because other centers have seen what's happening there and they want to be part of it, both because they know that those centers are saving time and saving money and reinvesting that into the classroom, and also not insignificantly because all of those centers have had very strong results from state audits, which had not happened in the past. They have been able to increase their wages as they've reduced their headcount because of the hub services. They've been able to increase the time that their directors are spending in the classrooms because the administrative tasks have been taken away or absorbed by the hub. And as I said, they've had cleaner audits and improved their financial and administrative processes. In the future, they're going to work on establishing some shared benchmarks and metrics, which we feel is really important so that they can track their results among members. And their profile, the URL for their profile is here. They're also on the map that is on the Opportunities Exchange website. So let me just talk for a couple minutes about lessons learned, and then we'll open it up for questions. What are the key success drivers here? Well, you've heard me talk before about identifying or establishing the hubs early on in the process. The hubs are staffed with recognized and trusted leaders. It's important for there to be a local or regional funder that has deep knowledge both of early care and education, but also of the community. So they are not only an incubator, but a funder and an advocate for the Alliance. Positive early results can attract new members to the Alliance, and really having a good understanding of the cost of providing the services is essential for understanding the costs and benefits and being able to plan. Measuring results is really critical, and that's because you can't know whether this makes any sense to do all this work, and you can't go raise funding if you don't know what the results are going to be. So it's very important to establish goals and metrics and then collect the data from the very beginning. And there are two categories that we're talking about here. One is the cost and the savings of the Alliance itself. So how much does it cost to staff the hub and to provide the services, and is that cost more than offset by what happens to member revenues and time and cost savings? But also, and more importantly, what are the effects of those changes on the members' businesses and ultimately on children and families? So is there administrative time that's being saved, and if so, where is that time going? Are the increased revenues and those hours that are saved and the dollars saved reallocated to the classroom, and what is the effect on children and families? Those kinds of issues are very important to be able to understand, and it's much easier to do that from the beginning rather than to try to jump in mid-course and try to measure that. We always want to talk about factors that can derail shared services. If you create a back office as just another layer of bureaucracy without changing what else you're doing, that's not helping anything. If you start with a very overly challenging issue, whether that's subpools or some other thing that's just very hard to get going, it can be very discouraging. You need to have a pricing or fee plan that's well understood by members. If you have a weak partner, that can bring the whole thing down, and as I've talked about before, you need trust and you need a shared vision and you need buy-in. So in sum, everybody needs to be willing to change. Everybody needs to be willing to look deeply at how the current programs are staffed and administered and be open to new ways of working. Everybody's got to agree on that to do this, you got to focus on the common good and not just on what's going on in your organization. That you got to be willing to share financial and program information with others and there is a need to lead your staff, your board, your parents, and other stakeholders through a successful change process. So we encourage you to explore more on our website, and I'm going to turn it over to Karen now to ask whatever questions are being asked out there, and I'm going to just encourage our colleague Louise Stoney to also jump in at any point to answer any questions. So Karen?
Great. We've got a few questions in queue, so I'm going to get started right now. There's a question about the member fee. One of our participants wondered about the free or reduced fee, if that could backfire because centers would get used to a less amount, and then they may, when they have to pay the full amount, it feels like a shock. So are there any reactions to this? Yeah, go ahead, Libby.
Yeah, I was just going to start, and then anyone else can jump in. But at some point I talked about the need to, I think in the MOU discussion, to be very clear about what the process is for what the fees are and how they are developed. And so I think that if there is an understanding that there may be a period where those fees will be paid for, but that eventually they are going to have to come up with those fees themselves, but also an understanding that there's the expectation that their costs are going to go down, and if things are done the way they're supposed to, their costs are going to go down and their revenues are hopefully going to go up, and the two of those things should be able to more than offset whatever fees are going to eventually be paid. But I think the main thing is that people need to understand up front rather than to be surprised by all of a sudden somebody saying, you didn't pay anything last year, but this year you got to pay full freight. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in.
No, the only other thing I will just say is that I've also heard that if you wait a long time before charging anything, then the shock is even more increased. So at least if you're kind of easing them along, paying a little bit at first and then it increases over time, they're used to the process of paying for services. But if you allow them to have services for free for too long, it's then harder to actually charge for it.
This is Louise. Let me just jump in here too. The whole issue of fees is really challenging, so I don't want to minimize that. But I also want to really underscore the importance of the hub agency fundamentally understanding the cost per child and the business model of the participating centers, so that they're understanding the relationship between the fees they charge and the revenue likelihood and costs of the participating sites, so that it is so we really talk a lot about in shared services, the success of the hub is linked to the success of the participating centers and homes. And that's a very unusual kind of relationship in early care and education, but it's really key to the success of a shared service alliance. Our successful hubs really know what the price point is in their participating centers, and they're working to make sure that their fee structure not only fits that, but makes them more able to shift dollars into classrooms for teachers.
So I'm going to link two questions together, both dealing with costs. One is a question, do we have any information on the overall cost to implement a shared service alliance, or perhaps an example of how much it costs for the one in Richmond? And then there was also a question about the cost of technology and how that was funded. If we could just share a little bit of information about how that was handled.
Sure. This is Sharon. I'm happy to take that question. I think it's important. We talked about how the last thing you want to do when you're launching an alliance is to create a whole new infrastructure, a whole new organization that you then have to fundraise for. So what happened in Richmond was Commonwealth Autism had a couple of staff people who had the right skill set. And so they began to assign pieces of work to those folks to really drill down and start doing some of the very detailed operational work. And so, I'll just tell you that in the first year of operations, we're able to get an enormous chunk of the back office work done for a little under $60,000, which I think is pretty affordable when you understand all of the work that everyone is putting into this. Now, because the funding community is paying such close attention to this. They are interested in supporting a successful startup. And so a new funder came to the table and said, how can we help? We're interested in technology. And so they were able to write and receive a grant of $25,000 over a period of 3 years that will pay all of the licensing fees, that will pay for some new equipment that was needed, and it also, most importantly, pays for the time to convert all of the data and get everything set up so that we can measure and track all the metrics that need to be tracked. That's probably the biggest cost, is the human cost in setting the system up so that it will operate kind of seamlessly from here on out. But that was underwritten with this grant.
Great. Okay, so let me take a different topic. There's a question about convening organizations. Do you have any recommendations for convening organizations, or how to build a group of convening organizations that can serve as thought partners in exploring the level of interest in a community?
Louise, do you want to take that?
Well, I think part of this is really thinking strategically about who are the thought partners, what role might they play, and what do they need to know. So I think if you go back to Libby's slide, way back early on, Libby, that slide where it talked about how there's different folks that could be involved in shared services. There are providers, there are policymakers, there are funders, and each one of those players has a different set of information that they need to know, or a different set of things they need to think about. So part of this is, we feel pretty strongly that if you're going to bring people together in a meeting, you want the meeting to be meaningful. And so there's some benefit, obviously, when you're introducing this, to having some kind of a meeting where you might convene people to just do a basic Shared Services 101, this is what it's all about. But then you may want to really think about drilling down and staying in touch with your policymakers, helping them understand how shared services is going to help their needs. For example, in most of our alliances, the states have strong QRIS systems, and it's really important for the participating centers to be successful in the QRIS. We can show those kinds of results, and so can the alliances. Those are things that matter to the states. In exchange for that, alliances have also asked states for flexibility in regulatory rules, or in allowing them to automate paperwork that's typically submitted by hand. So it's often a deeper kind of ongoing relationship that really is what you need over time, rather than kind of a big broad brush meeting. So typically I think what happens is they might form an advisory committee, they might have an initial meeting to say, here's what it's all about, let's get excited, and then they would have smaller subgroups of folks that they would stay in touch with over time and meet with over time as the alliance emerges and they have deeper conversations that need to happen.
Okay, we have a question about the web platform. We have a participant that has the web platform resource, and they're in the process of promoting it and wants to know, how do we best explain the benefits that it offers while developing the plan for a shared service alliance?
So Karen, do you actually want to talk about Battle Creek too? You should add that, and then I know I heard somebody else answering too.
But I think that we need to just explain what the web platform is for those who might not know. So you may want to start with that.
Great. So the web platform is a platform that has a variety of resources that will that help you to be more efficient. So it has resources for the classroom, for parents, for administration. Basically, it's resources that have been vetted by an advisory board, so they're all kind of best-in-class tools, and they're all tools that can be customizable. So, for instance, if you need an employee handbook and you haven't developed one, there is a template that you could download from the web platform that you could customize, so that you're not starting from scratch. A lot of the work has been done, and you can customize it and tailor it to your needs. So that's quick and dirty. Louise, I don't know if you want to add anything, and then I can talk about some of the
this is Libby. I just want to add. So this is different from the Opportunities Exchange website. The web platform is a national platform, the national name of which I think is ecesharedresources.net. And folks can buy into that national platform, or what most people do is on a state-by-state basis, a group in a state will customize in some way, or at least brand the platform for their particular state and the needs and resources in their particular state. So right now, I think there are about 28 or 29 states in the country that have the branded or customized version of this web platform. It is not, we do not power that web platform. It's powered by a separate organization and overseen by an advisory board that consists of all the different representatives from all the different states. And if you go on the Opportunities Exchange website, there you will find a map of the web-based alliance that shows which states are in it. So I just wanted to clarify that. But Karen, maybe you want to talk about what happened in Michigan.
Yeah, so we're actually in the process. We do not have the web platform in Michigan yet, but we are working to bring it to Michigan. And the benefit of having the platform is that it provides a resource that, it would be statewide. So one of the things that we're grappling with in Battle Creek is as I mentioned, there are 3 centers that are part of the Alliance. There are other centers that are interested that need, different supports, need resources that will help them be more efficient, improve the quality of their education. And having the platform would be a great way to be able to really help centers even centers that aren't part of the Alliance. So they could tap into cost savings. I mean, CCA Global, which is the organization that powers the web platform, has negotiated, discounts with a number of vendors that ECA providers work with. And so these centers could tap into discounts. They could tap into things that are going to save them time. And in terms of communicating the benefits, CCA Global has created a flyer that talks about the savings both in time that you could get by accessing the resources on the platform, as well as cost savings. So, Libby, I don't know if we have that on the platform, but that's something that if folks emailed me, contacted me, I could share that with them, because I don't think that's on the OpEx page.
It is.
It is, okay.
I believe it is.
Okay.
And I guess I would just summarize by saying that the platform is a lighter touch version of shared services. So it is not, it is not sharing staff. It is not deeply changing the way that you do business, but it's a way to share over a broad geography a lot of really important resources.
So I see that we are right up against time. I just do want to acknowledge we did have one other question about family child care, and wondering if all of the alliances that we talked about today were center-based, or were any family child care homes included. And the alliance examples that we discussed today are all involving child care centers, but on the Opportunities Exchange website, if you go to that map that Libby described, there are some profiles of alliances that include family child care homes. So Infant Toddler Daycare in Virginia is an example. Early Connections Learning Center. They are center-based, but they also work with a network of family providers. So I would say check our website. I will also say that contact information for Libby, Louise, Sharon, and myself is also on the website. So if you do have any additional questions, please contact us. We'd be happy to help. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.